Hello, I hope everybody's doing well. This week we're going to cover measurement of behavior. In doing so, we will also cover selection of target behaviors or target responses, defining target behaviors, and different measurement procedures. So just to review the basics of single subject design, we learned that one of the features is that it involves the repeated measurement of a response or of a target behavior. So that repeated measurement allows us to have a moment-to-moment picture or understanding of the level of behavior as it's occurring. So for example, if we're talking about a clinical case where an individual is engaging in aggressive behavior, we can measure that aggressive behavior across several days and have a baseline picture of the current level of that aggressive behavior. So that repeated measurement is important. It's also important because it lends itself to a methodology that we refer to as steady state strategy or steady state logic. That is, we are making decisions based on levels of behavior, those levels that are measured. Right, so if baseline shows that aggressive responding is on average occurring 10 times per day, we can make a treatment decision and implement treatment and hopefully decrease that aggression so we have some point of comparison. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of the basics about what we mean when we say behavior. We'll talk a little bit about the environment as well. We'll talk about some typical responses or behaviors that are measured in behavior analytic research. But by and large, we'll focus on the applied side. That is, how do we select target behaviors for the individuals with whom we're working, and how do we define those and then measure them? So we'll talk a lot about those areas. And all of this comes from the APA Handbook of Behavior Analysis, Chapter 6, which is available online through the library. But I've also added some other review notes. So first, just to review, the dependent variable is the behavior that we are interested in. So we're going to observe it, we're going to analyze it, we're going to measure it, and hopefully we are going to change it. So when we're talking about research or clinical practice, the dependent variable for us, by and large, is the behavior. We could call it the target behavior, the target response, any of those names, but essentially we're talking about behavior. And the dependent variable refers to the fact that the behavior or the level and or change in behavior depends upon an experimental manipulation or the introduction of treatment, which we would call the independent variable. So the independent variable is introduced, and if there is going to be a change in the behavior, it's going to be dependent on that independent variable. So if we're working within the science of behavior, a definition for behavior might read something like this. Behavior is that portion of an organism's interaction with its environment that involves movement of some part of the organism and results in a measurable change. Now that's, of course, a dry definition, and we could think of it really as everything that an organism does. Right, so movement certainly involved if we're talking about humans. Vocalizations, or what we call verbal behavior, is certainly involved. So we could think of it really as any behavior that's going to have an outcome or operate on the environment. That is, it's going to produce a change in the environment. So when a pigeon pecks a key, there's movement in the environment. The pigeon's head is moving, the key, the little key is displaced, it's moved in some way. So behavior is operating on the environment in that respect. Eventually, you will start to learn more about verbal behavior, and you will see that verbal behavior also produces an outcome on the environment in a listener. So it really, this definition identifies behavior as some interaction between the organism and the environment. We don't really have to think that dry and scientific all the time. Let's just say that it's everything people say and do. Now, it is important to note that thinking can be behavior too. The problem with it in a scientific analysis is it's not observable. We only know what somebody's thinking because they tell us what they are thinking. So it becomes sort of an unreliable measure if we're doing some analysis. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on considering thinking. You'll clearly get that in AB 503 or perhaps 513, verbal behavior. So in applied behavior analysis, we're going to focus on behavior that an observer, somebody looking at the individual, can detect and thus record. If we consider the fact that behavior is part of a biological phenomenon, we need to have a functioning biological system, muscles and neural activity and so forth, central nervous system, in order to behave. That is part of behavior. It's not the only part, but it is certainly part of it. So movement, environmental interaction is key to that. Behavior involves some movement, right? Our muscles move our body. So the movement stems or extends from our biology. Another way we might conceptualize behavior is as an interface with one's environment. Again, I'm speaking sort of in a dry scientific manner, but behavior is a biological result of an organism's interaction with its environment. They sense the environment, perhaps through their eyes, through their nose, through touch, and so forth, and they behave with respect to the environment to produce an outcome. So behavior is not something we possess, and that's a slightly important distinction because other areas of psychology might consider behavior to stem sort of from an internal state. So we wouldn't say the child has aggression or the child has good behavior. It's more of something they do, right? The child is engaging in good behavior. The child is engaging in aggression. It's not necessarily stored somewhere. There's an interesting informal test that we can consider when we're trying to determine if something is a behavior. Now, I'm jumping ahead here in talking about sort of selecting target behaviors, but one of the challenges that people have when selecting target behaviors is, one, selecting a class of behavior that is amenable to describing clearly and of course measuring, or in the definition they start to draw on more mentalistic terms like frustration and so forth. So the dead man's test, again, is an informal test. It was coined by Ogden Lindsley, and basically it states that if a dead man can do it, then it's not a behavior, right? So we'll talk a little bit later about issues of a common issue that students fall into when defining student behavior as either non-compliant versus compliant. So if you think about this dead man's test, a dead man could be non-compliant. You provide an instruction, the dead man is not going to follow the instruction. So it's not really a good behavior. Often we'll flip it and say compliance, right? So compliance to adult instruction could be the target behavior. Clearly, we can't talk about behavior without considering the environment. So for the environment, when we're doing our analyses, it can be the full set of physical circumstances in which the organism exists, right? So for us as humans, the world around us, if you're in a classroom or an office, the world around you, as well as an internal state. So things that are happening, as we say, within your skin, your biology, are part of the environment. So when we have a headache, that is an environmental condition that we as an organism is subject to. So it can influence our behavior. So this sort of barrier of the skin isn't necessarily an important thing in behavior analysis. The key factor is when we're doing analysis, can it be measured? Right? We can measure physiological responses, so clearly it can be part of our analysis. Often it's not always needed, but certainly it can be an important factor. So we're going to analyze behavior in terms of environmental conditions, antecedent conditions and consequence conditions. Now, we're not going to really talk a lot about analyzing behavior in this particular lecture, but it is important to note what we're talking about when we say environment. So that does raise the question regarding cognitive events or cognitions or thoughts about behavior. So cognitive events do occur. We certainly know that. Hopefully you know that you think as well. So how do we know that they are occurring? Well, as an individual, I am engaging in those cognitions or those thoughts. So I know that they're occurring. The external world would only know they're occurring by doing something like one, they could certainly ask me, and I could say, yeah, I'm thinking about that, or I'm thinking this, that, or the other thing. More scientifically would be to measure brain activity. So there's what's called a functional magnetic resonance imaging process, whereby when individuals are engaged in tasks like decision making and so forth, they see areas of the brain light up. So this is taken as evidence for cognitions. And in fact, it's quite good evidence. We're learning more and more about the brain the more this research continues. The problem is, we're still not at the point where we could say that this particular area of the brain is lighting up, therefore it means the person is thinking this, or the decision is this, right? So it's sort of, these areas contain millions of neurons, so it's hard to really pinpoint what's actually happening. Nevertheless, again, we are learning more and more from these brain scans. So interesting research. It's just not something that becomes important in right as of now in our analysis of behavior. So cognitive events are not going to be important for us. We will think of thoughts as more behavior to be explained. Again, we have that problem of observability. So another sort of scientific term is unit of analysis. In any science, there is a unit of analysis. All this means is, what is the phenomenon we are looking at, right? What are we going to end up measuring? And in behavior analysis, the unit of analysis is the response class. Now, you may have heard this term in ABA 503. Essentially, a response class is a collection of individual responses that have a common source of influence on the environment. So if you consider the behavior of door opening, there are a variety of ways you could open a door. Presumably by turning the handle, pushing it with your hand, elbow, or foot. And those are all topographically different forms of behavior. They look different, but they all produce the same outcome. So we could classify them as a door opening response class. So we're talking about a class of responses, essentially. The form here is not as important as the environmental outcome. So you'll see as we get into more specific target behaviors, again, similar to a response class or a response, that we may classify a target behavior as aggression, and it can be defined as different forms of aggression: hitting, kicking, pinching, scratching, headbutting, the list goes on, and we could define those more specifically. What does hitting look like? What does kicking look like? So we'll talk about that. But right now we're kind of thinking broad, and in our science of behavior, the thing that we are interested in is the response class. Behavior. Okay. So there are three types of response classes that are often the focus of behavioral research. We are going to focus more on 2 and 3. So I'm going to move quickly through this section because you probably have already learned much of this. In respondent behavior, we're talking about reflexes there. So I'm not going to read these definitions. Again, I expect you got this from another course, but respondent behavior, or Pavlovian conditioning, classical conditioning, is mainly focused on reflexive behavior. And the thing to really think about there is a reflex is going to be elicited by a specific stimulus, right? So these environmental stimuli always or consistently elicit the response. You add the stimulus, response occurs. So there's unconditioned reflexes, there could be conditioned reflexes, and so forth. Okay, sometimes we'll refer to them as a respondent because it's respondent behavior. You could think of it in terms of responding to the presentation of some stimulus. What we're going to focus on more in this course and others is operant behavior. And operant conditioning was pioneered by B.F. Skinner. Obviously, others were involved, but he is sort of the main figure in the experimental analysis of behavior, and certainly has influenced applied behavior analysis a great deal. So extending from classical conditioning in operant behavior, we're talking about responses or behaviors that have some functional relationship with the consequences that follow them. All right, so that is the distinction. In responding conditioning, or respondent or reflexive behavior, a stimulus is added and it causes the reflex. In operant conditioning, there are consequences that shape and maintain behavior. Now, of course, we know already from the work that we've already covered that behavior occurs in an environmental context. And in that environmental context, there are what we would call discriminative stimuli. Think of them as signals or stimuli that, because of the consequences that follow the behavior that occurs in the presence of the stimuli, they've acquired the function of setting the occasion for behavior to occur. We see a green light, we press the gas pedal to accelerate, right? So the green light is discriminative for go. Okay, so behavior is always more likely to occur in the presence of a discriminative stimulus than in its absence because of this sort of operant conditioning history that one has. So, mainly operant conditioning, we're focusing on behavior that is maintained by consequences. And we could take that a step further and talk about the discriminated operant, right? This is just simply behavior that occurs to classes of both antecedent and consequent stimuli, and more specifically, behavior that occurs differentially, if you will. So a good example of a discriminated operant would be key pecking that occurs in the presence of a green light, but not in the presence of red. So the pigeon in the operant chamber here is making a discrimination. Their behavior is discriminated, right? It only occurs in the presence of green, not in the presence of red, because of the consequent stimuli. And I assume you've if you haven't already, you will learn that in ABA 503. So let's shift gears here and talk more about the applied realm, working with individuals with autism and developmental disabilities, or in standard classrooms, or working with your own children, or sports performance, business, those things. So the applied realm, we're talking about applying behavioral principles to behaviors that are socially significant, right? We're trying to improve people's lives here. So there are sort of three broad areas where we find ourselves working as behavior analysts. And those are addressing behavioral deficits, behavioral excesses, or addressing problems of stimulus control. Let's just take the first two areas, behavioral deficits and behavioral excesses. So at a basic level, as a BCBA, you are charged with helping people who are experiencing behavioral deficits or engaging in behavioral excesses. Behavioral deficits specifically refer to behaviors that need to be increased, right? So we're in this sense, we're engaged in applying behavioral principles in teaching methodologies, skill building, what I call skill acquisition. We're trying to improve an individual's communication, hygienic skills, academic skills, any of those areas, right? So the individual is not functioning at the target or optimal level. If it's a student in a second grade class, they are not functioning at grade level. So we need to select some target behaviors or to remediate or teach. I'm drawing on other examples here. So sports performance, the player is not playing at the optimal level. There are some skills that they have not acquired or maybe are not up to an optimal level. So we are engaged in teaching and training and so forth to get them to that point. So they have some skills, but they're not at the optimal level. So we need to improve them. Behavioral excesses are going to be things like challenging behavior. These are behaviors that need to be decreased. So we could, again, think of the context of serving individuals with disabilities. Challenging behaviors might be SIB, aggression and property destruction, or a variety of other behaviors. We'll look at some more examples shortly in this PowerPoint. Or they could be other behaviors. Again, thinking of these areas outside of developmental disabilities, workplace accidents, right, is sort of a behavioral excess. We need things we would need to decrease. If a player is always making a foul in a sport, we would want to decrease that, and we could devise methodologies and monitoring systems to try to improve these behaviors. So we're reducing behavior. So again, behavioral deficits, behavioral excesses, it's either we're increasing behavior, presumably adaptive skills, or we're decreasing problematic or challenging behavior. The last area is a little bit more difficult to understand at this point in time, but here we're talking about problems of stimulus control. That is, behaviors are present and they occur, so they're in the individual's repertoire, but they're not occurring at the appropriate time and place or under the appropriate conditions. So, for example, if a child is answering a door, right? I tell my child not to answer the door at any time at this age, but certainly as she gets older, if there's a stranger at the door, I wouldn't want her answering the door. But if she did, that would be a problem of stimulus control. That is, she can engage in door opening behavior, but she's doing so inappropriately, right? Or another example might be a player can engage in a certain skill, but they might do so at the wrong time. So the stimuli that should control behavior are not controlling behavior. So we need to devise some methodologies to bring behavior under the appropriate stimulus control. We will talk a lot more about that in other courses. So right now, let's keep it simple and think about behaviors we're trying to increase and behaviors we're trying to decrease. So the first step in the analysis of behavior, or the first step when we have met with our client or client's parents and so forth is trying to figure out what are the target behaviors, right? If we're talking about skill deficits, we need to determine, is the skill in the individual's repertoire but not at an optimal level or a criterion level, or is the skill not present at all, or is it a behavioral excess, right? So there's problematic behavior and we need to address that or reduce it rather. So we have to sort of pinpoint specific behaviors that we're going to work on. And now this may seem more simple than it really is. If we're talking about challenging behaviors, often somebody will come to us and say, can you help us? Our child is engaging in aggressive behavior, right? So our goal there is we kind of know it's aggressive behavior, but we want to be able to pinpoint what type of aggressive behavior, what does it look like? So the first step is just selecting the targets. Maybe we have to determine, are we going to use a class of responses like self-injurious behavior that includes head banging, self-biting, and self-scratching? Or are we going to just use individual responses? We're going to select head banging as a target, self-biting as another target, self-scratching, right? So we'll talk about how we can utilize these, and we'll look at some examples. But the idea here is we're just selecting the target behavior. Again, if we're talking about skills, what are the skills, right? If I was working with a first grade student who was not functioning at an optimal level, or what we probably call up to grade level, I would have to determine what skills should somebody in first grade have, or somebody at a certain age, and then determine what are the correct target behaviors. So these examples up here are kind of simple: correct responses, on-task behavior, communication, but it could be something as specific as addition with single-digit numbers, right? Things of that nature. The most important thing about applied behavior analysis, is that the target behavior should be socially significant. Now, if we're involved in most of the work that we find ourselves trying to improve the lives of others, that's not a problem. Socially significant behavior is, by and large, much of what we do. But if you're talking about applied behavior analytic research, researchers have to take care to make sure that the behaviors they're looking at have some social significance. So you'll see some studies out there that involve humans that are behavior analytic in nature, but maybe the participant is hitting a switch, right? Just pressing a button and there's a reinforcement delivered. Now, pressing a button is not necessarily socially significant for an adult or a child for that matter. However, if it's looking at a specific behavioral principle, like the effects of reinforcement, then maybe it has some social significance. So just something to think about there. All right, so let's say we've gone through a process of selecting target behaviors. By and large, that process involves interviewing family members or the teacher, stakeholders for the individual, and observing the individual in some way. So we're starting our analysis. We're selecting the target behaviors. The next step is to define the target behavior, and this again seems easier than it really is. So in defining target behaviors, we're coming up with what some people will call an operational definition. What is the definition of the behavior that we are selecting? What does it look like? So target behavior definitions should be objective, clear, and complete. This means that you when you're defining the target behavior, like something like hitting, you need to make it objective such that anybody who's observing or a reasonably trained person would know what hitting is. Now, when you think of objective versus subjective, if I were to say the child using an open hand to hit another child with force, the with force part is kind of subjective, right? Because what I see as a forceful contact with the hand and what you see may be different. So that sort of goes against being objective. Sometimes we do things like that, though, because it's very difficult to come up with a good definition, but we want to always strive to be very objective. When we're considering a clear definition, what we need to consider is, can a reasonably trained person, or really anybody, read this definition, observe the person, and know when the behavior is occurring? Right? So what, particularly in the type of work we do, because we often function as a consultant where we train people to collect data for us, like some of you who are working in the field as an RBT are probably collecting data, and your behavior analyst provided training, and maybe they provided a written definition of the target behaviors. So is it clear enough that you always know when it occurs when you see it? And then, of course, complete. You need to make sure that it's going to contain every topography or form of a response that you are interested in, and excludes other things. We'll talk about this shortly, but consider the example of banging on a desk, right? So do we want, or no, let's go back to aggression. So open hand, making forceful contact with another part of somebody's body, right? So now let's consider an example where an individual's nonverbal and they tap on somebody's shoulder to get their attention. That would meet the definition of an open hand contact with somebody else's body. So in that sense, we need to distinguish what's going to be considered the target behavior versus what not to consider as a target behavior. So again, it's a little more difficult than it seems. Often target behavior definitions are going to include active verbs describing the individual's actions. They are doing things. The individual engages in a particular behavior. And it's going to describe what we call the topography or the form. What does the behavior look like? And I already have given some examples, using an open hand or a closed fist, making contact with another person's body. We could look at outcomes resulting in injury. That might not be the best way to define aggressive behavior, because any hitting, whether it results in an injury or not, could be aggressive. So we want to take that into consideration. Sometimes we will write the definition to include a description of antecedent conditions and consequences. And I'll point this out when we get to the examples. So there are two approaches to defining a target behavior or a target response. I want you to start to think of those things interchangeably. A response, target behavior, operant, all of those terms are interchangeable. So two ways we could define target behaviors. One is by the response class, or what we might call the functional response class. So we're going to include only responses whose occurrence depends on a particular class of antecedents or consequent stimuli, or let's just think of it more simply as behaviors that produce the same outcome. So it's very common, you'll review articles in Java where you see a functional response class definition. That is, the individual or the participant engages in aggression, defined as hitting, kicking, pushing, biting. So these are all responses as individual responses as part of a class of a response, aggression, what we're going to call aggression. So the forms are very different, but they all sort of produce a similar outcome in that they are could result in injury. Now, of course, when we use definitions like this, we obviously have to know, well, what is hitting, what is kicking, what is pushing, what is biting. So we do have to know what those behaviors look like. But nevertheless, you see researchers and practitioners use definitions like these. So if the child engages in multiple forms of aggression, it's probably better to use a response class definition. If they only hit, then let's just simply use hitting and define that more precisely. Or if they engage in self-injurious behavior, multiple forms, head banging, self-biting, self-scratching, we might use this response class definition. If they only engage in head banging, then maybe we just simply use that. So therefore, the other way to define a target behavior is topographically, or what they call a topographical response class definition. You don't have to really remember these terms, but they're not used in practice. We don't say, well, create a functional response class definition. All you need to know is there are two ways you could go about defining behavior when you're selecting your target behavior. So topographically, we're going to refer to behavior defined by form or shape of the response. So again, looking at hitting specifically, it could include closed fist or open hand, forcefully making contact with another person's body. Now, of course, I made the error of creating something that could be subjective rather than objective in there. Forcefully making contact. So again, if there are two observers, one may believe it's a forceful contact, the other may not see it as forceful. So we'd have to consider that. I'll show you some examples later, but some folks will add sort of measurable or loosely measurable dimensions, like with a wind up of 6 inches or greater, right? So that would sort of indicate that the individual is at a distance from the person who's getting hit and sort of making some contact at a distance rather than a close tap on the shoulder. Biting, child's teeth making contact with another person's skin or clothing, right? So these are sort of basic examples. Again, we'd have to make sure that we're capturing every form of the behavior for that given individual. We're not thinking of this sort of esoterically, like hitting is this. We're thinking for this client with whom I'm working, when they engage in hitting, it looks like this. So for example, if they only use their fist, then maybe the definition should say that. If they use their fist or open hand, or maybe a karate chop, you'd want to include that, right? So these are individually defined responses for the client with whom you're working. They're not generic. That said, it can be useful to look to the literature to see examples of how other people are defining target behaviors, if you find yourself having difficulty doing so. So once you come up with a definition, you may need to add some variation or refinement to it, right? So we can include what we might call the temporal dimensions of the behavior, some dimension of time within the definition. So for example, if you're talking about a target behavior like crying, which can be a target behavior, how you define it, obviously would be individualized, but how would you make a distinction of when crying, one episode or instance of crying begins and ends, and then the next one begins? So you might have a time period between responses, right? So crying could be defined as, I'm going to make this up, loud nonsensical vocalizations accompanied by tears, and each response would have 3 seconds in between, right? So if an individual was whining loudly, stopped, and then 3 seconds passed and they began again, I would count that as a second instance. And then, of course, going forward, a third instance and a fourth. So we would add this dimension to make it easier for the data collector or ourselves to record the behavior. Another option would be to use a latency between events and responses, or the time required to complete the response. So I have some examples down here. Let's just consider these. Pace of eating, right? Or eating. Sometimes we would have a distinction that eating involves 1 bite per minute, right? Anything different than that, we might not consider or could be problematic. Following a direction, right? So it might, that part of the definition may include initiating the task within 3 seconds of the instruction, right? So for example, if we're talking about compliance, which is common in an educational setting or working with children, your definition might include that they have to do something within 3 seconds, or else it's not compliance, right? So if you provide an instruction and the child does not engage in the task for 10 seconds, then it's not compliance. They have to do so within 3 seconds. Now, when we're considering these restrictions or refinements, it is because we're looking for a specific target response or a optimal level of the response, right? So maybe the problem, the challenging behavior we're working on, or the skill deficit we're working on, is that the child completes or follows an instruction but not immediately, and that becomes problematic in a classroom. So the teacher will provide an instruction, they may not start the work for 5 minutes, and that's just not acceptable in the classroom. So therefore we have to put a restriction on it, or a refinement to the definition. Okay, completing homework within 24 hours, right? So again, if I were to assign homework even in a class like this, I put a due date on it, and anything after the due date is not completing homework, right? So we would consider these when we're coming up with our operational definitions or defining our target behaviors. Some other considerations, again, use established definitions, even though we are individualizing these operational definitions or defining target behaviors according to what we're seeing in the individual. It doesn't preclude us from looking to Java to see, well, how have other people defined this? So for example, you might have to address something like lying behavior. Lying. How would you go about defining that? It can be pretty complex. Part of it probably involves some form of a vocalization. Part of it probably involves a vocalization that is not true. How do you validate the truth? Well, you have to do an investigation. So something like lying, on the surface, you and I know what that means, but to actually define it in observable, clear terms is very difficult. So I may go to Java to see what folks use. Or if we're utilizing a common teaching approach to generate vocalized responses, called a procedure called script fading, we might eventually want the person to not only engage in reading the script or a scripted response, but we might want them to engage in unscripted responses, right? So we could teach them to vocalize by reading a script, but eventually we want them to vocalize without reading the script. So we'd have to define scripted versus unscripted responses. So I'd probably look to Java to see what other people have used. Sometimes we have to find exemplars, particularly when we're talking about a skill deficit type of case where we're trying to improve behavior or teach new behaviors. Well, what are the comparative norms, right? If we're trying to teach a child appropriate question asking, right, or asking their peer questions, what do typical kids do, right? We wouldn't want to overshoot that or set a criterion too high. Here's another good example of reducing problematic behavior. I've run into this. Parents want to reduce their child's use of vulgarity or cursing, right? And I always sort of approach that as, what does a typical kid look like? So we'd want to have some comparative norm. We wouldn't want to, change somebody's behavior beyond the norm. So we could look to that. Sometimes there's database comparative norms. Sometimes we might just take a normative sample, right? If you're another example, out of seat behavior for somebody in third grade. So we could target we want the child to be in the seat the entire class period. But if that's not what typical third graders do, one thing we might consider is let's observe in a typically developing third grade classroom and see on the average how many times does somebody get out of his or her seat. We address this. Not doing. Not doing is not a behavior, right? So something like non-compliance, which is very common for young behavior analysts or folks who are not quite BCBAs yet, it's very common for them to target non-compliance, particularly when you're thinking about the population that we work with by and large. You tell them to do something, they don't do it. Well, that's non-compliance. It's always better to restate behavior that sort of is not doing in terms of what the participant should or could be doing, right? So I would target compliance. Another thing to think about is behavior discrete with a discrete beginning and end, like a head bang? They make contact at the hard surface with their head, and that's the end. You can count it once. They do it again, you count it twice. They do it again, you count it 3. So for other behaviors that are not that clear, we might consider episodes of behavior or episodic behavior, right? These are brief periods of responding defined by the frequent occurrence of one or more specific responses. Something like tantruming, right? Tantruming could include crying, yelling, banging. It could include aggression. So if we're seeing a group of behaviors that casually we might say, well, that kid's tantruming, we could use that as a target behavior, and we could operationally define it in some way that entails all of these other forms of topographies or targets: kicking, flailing, yelling, crying, screaming. But the other thing is, when we're considering measuring this response, there isn't sort of this individual instance that tantrum begins and ends just like that. It'll vary in duration. So we might consider an episode of tantruming, right? So therefore, in that episode, we would need to have some distinguishing feature to distinguish one episode of tantruming from the next. So, for example, behaviors A, B, and C occurring. If more than 5 seconds passes before a behavior occurs again, then it's a new instance or a new episode. Okay, hope that makes sense. All right, let's look at some examples here. Aggression: hitting, biting, or scratching the therapist. So now, again, this would be a response class definition. All of these behaviors are in a response class of aggression. Clearly, we have to know what they look like topographically. So we probably would still have to go to the extent of defining what is hitting, what is biting, what is scratching. Disruption: throwing objects, pushing furniture over, kicking, hitting objects, or falling to the floor. So again, kind of a response class definition. All of these individual behaviors are part of the class that we call disruption or disruptive behavior. Activity engagement: facial orientation toward activity materials, appropriate use of activity materials, or comments related to the activity. So this is sort of a topographical response definition. And this is a common one, right? So sometimes we want to increase or improve somebody's activity engagement, whatever that activity is. It could be very specific, and our definition could include that. If we're in an academic environment, activity engagement might be with the academic materials, and we can include that in the definition. Facial orientation toward academic activity materials. If we're, let's just say we're coaching a children's basketball team, right? And the coach is providing some lesson training, and kids are sort of wandering off, or their eyes are trailing off. So we might want to have engagement defined as facial orientation toward the coach, toward the materials and things of that nature. So hopefully these are giving you some ideas about how these things are defined. Compliance, the child independently completing or initiating the activity described in the instruction within 10 seconds. So again, this one's good because one, we're focusing on a behavior that could occur, compliance. We have a restriction or a refinement in there where they have to engage in compliance within 10 seconds for it to be counted as compliance. Now again, keep in mind, if I'm the observer utilizing this definition and I see the teacher provide an instruction, I start counting, maybe it's casual, looking at a watch, and 12 seconds passes and then the child does the instruction, it's not compliance because they didn't do it within the 10 seconds. We really have to be that rigid with these definitions and with our measurement of behavior with respect to these definitions. Another interesting thing about this definition is the fact that it says the child independently completing the task. We're going to consider compliance. Now, when we start looking at skill acquisition programs or teaching procedures, we'll see that we could work on something like compliance, and part of the process of working on it may entail the therapist utilizing procedures like prompting or physical guidance, modeling, shaping to bring about the response of compliance. Right? So if I'm trying to teach a child to discriminate between a red block and a blue block, I put them on a desk, I say touch red. If they don't do that, I could utilize teaching procedures like physically guide. I could say touch red and physically guide them to touch red. There are other procedures that we could use. We're not going to get into the details of that. But so now, with respect to those procedures and this definition, if I have to physically guide the individual to comply, it's not compliance. So it would not be counted. So we do other things like measure compliance, prompted compliance, unprompted or independent, and so forth. Okay, a couple more. Whining, high-pitched, unintelligible cry. Again, we might have to add things to this to make it more clear. Unscripted verbalizations. I just gave this example on a previous slide. Verbalizations that were not modeled in a textual script but were appropriate to the context of the toy. So if we're trying to improve an individual's vocalizations, we can utilize scripts in a variety of forms, textual, auditory, video scripts, and these things have been shown to increase a person's language, particularly scripted language. They hear the script and they recite it. However, a secondary goal or an ultimate goal might be to get them to start saying things without the scripts. So we might want to measure unscripted verbalizations. So these are only some examples. I do encourage you to spend some time going through JABA to look for the target definitions and see how folks are defining them. Okay, here's an activity. Let's give this a try. So we're going to watch this YouTube and we'll try to come up with some target behaviors that we observe. Let's see if this works for me. Okay. The epic tantrum on
Isn't it time for family meal for real?
Thanks.
This Family Meals Month, it doesn't matter what you make or how you make it.
I have to wait through this ad here.
Shop right together.
Okay.
The next thing to do was really to get this house safe for me.
There we go.
So I took the family shopping to get some baby-proof items. However, little Max wasn't in the mood to go shopping.
Max, you hold on to the cart. He's not holding on to the cart. Max, you need to come and hold on to the cart. Thank you. Max started in with his usual behavior.
Max, where are you going?
Oh yeah.
Really? I'm gonna hand that over to you, Mum.
I'm gonna give you a warning. Do not take your hand off the cart. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Do you understand?
He wasn't listening, wasn't following directions.
He's gone again. Do I tell him he's gonna have a timeout like I just warned him? Max, I need to talk to you. Because you let go of the cart after I told you not to, when we get home, you're going to have a timeout. Max, stop right now. You're not gonna get a gumball today because you didn't listen to me. Okay?
Max kicked off. He was screaming at the top of his lungs. And Mum and Dad were beside themselves with embarrassment of how to deal with this situation.
If we would have given him the gumball, then that would let him know it's okay that he can let go of the cart and not follow directions.
Come back to the cart.
Stop for a minute. Right now, I want you to hold on to that cart and stop messing around. Right now. That's enough. Jen and Tony found what they were looking for, but they still need to follow through with discipline.
Okay. So we're not going to spend a lot of time with that, but some great examples in there. So if I were to consider the tantrum behavior, it seemed that the child cried, they jumped up and down, things of that nature, ran away. So that could all be part of a tantrum. Other target behaviors that I might pick up on to maybe work on would be holding the cart, right? That is a target behavior that we could teach, that we could address, and we can measure. So that's sort of the basic idea here. We conducted some maybe interviews, we observed, and we get an idea of what are we going to target here. The next thing we need to think about is conducting an observation. So in the process of our work as a behavior analyst, we have selected the target behaviors, we've defined them. Now we need to figure out, well, when and how are we going to observe them? And this can be simple, or it can be a little more challenging. The basic goal of an observation is to measure the level of the target behavior, and we're going to talk about measurement procedures shortly, but ideally here, what we want to do is set up or select times to observe the client or the individual, and obviously observe their behavior so that we can measure it. And we want it to be an accurate representation of what's happening. So if through an interview process or my casual observations, early observations, I see that the child engages in problematic behavior only when mom and dad take them to a store, then all of my observations should be done in the store. We'll talk about a variation. If we're working in a school and I see that the child's problematic behavior occurs primarily around the lunchtime period, then my observation should be done during lunch. If the child's behavior occurs throughout the entire day, then I have some flexibility to sample across the entire day. Some observations might be in the morning, some could be during the day, some could be during the evening. One thing that you'll find quickly when we talk about measurement is measuring behavior 24 hours a day is very laborious. So often we come up with these sort of observation periods, or what we could consider a session. So I might define that I'm going to go out to the home Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 10 a.m. to noon, and those are my observation sessions. Further, within those time periods, I could break it up to multiple observations. So I go out Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to noon, and from that 10 to noon period, I break up several 10-minute sessions. Okay, so we have to think about this. There isn't a script for coming up with this. You have to figure out what is going to be the best way for me to arrange my observations to measure the target behavior, and then thinking ahead to analyze the causes of behavior or to assess my intervention. Other things you need to think about is just the simple process of measuring the target behaviors during this observation, right? So we have to be able to identify responses that meet the requirements of the definition. Recall, I said if you see a behavior that does not meet the definition, it does not get recorded, even if it's close, right? We have to be that rigid, because if we're varying away from that definition, then our measurement, what we've measured in the past, becomes invalid. Consider this example. You're measuring a child's self-injurious behavior, and it's defined as head banging and self-biting. And you've been collecting data for a week using that definition. You hire somebody else to help you out with this case, and they're utilizing the definition of head banging and self-biting. The individual also starts scratching. So they include that because in their eyes, it is self-injurious. Well, what happens is now all of the data that you just collected becomes invalid. Or you could look at the other side, the data that person has collected is invalid because it includes a response that is not in the definition. We have to be very careful about this. That is very important. So we have to ignore behaviors that do not meet the requirements of the target behavior. Of course, if we see these things coming up and it seems like a problem that needs to be part of the definition, then we have to restart, come up with a new definition and restart. So sometimes when we're starting our observations, it reshapes our definition of the behavior. So something to think about. We want to determine the amount of selected dimensional quantities or qualities for each of these responses. We'll talk about that shortly. I'll reference this slide again. And you're going to make some kind of record, right? So we're going to collect data. By and large, we'll probably be using pen and paper data. Some folks will have a tablet or a laptop where they can where they can record what they're observing. So these observation periods need to be carefully selected because we want them to be representative of what's occurring. Again, if an individual's problem behavior only occurs around dinner time and we conduct all of our observations at lunchtime, it's not representative. So we need to carefully select these things, right? So, and this becomes difficult, particularly when you start consulting to multiple cases. Sometimes you can only get to the home at a certain time. But again, it's ethically responsible behavior to make sure we're conducting representative observations. A couple other things about observation, not necessarily important to applied work, but maybe in research. So observation in applied work is largely human observation, right? Me as a behavior analyst, the RBTs, registered behavior technicians that I supervise, parents and their teachers are trained to observe and collect data for me as the consultant. So basically applied researchers do rely on human observation, and the challenge there is it's very laborious, right? And there could be a lot of influential variables. If I'm not careful, I may miss responses, so my measurement could be unreliable. Or, as I mentioned before, if I drift from the operational definition, my measurement could become invalid. We'll talk about those things in a couple weeks when we discuss inter-observer agreement. But for now, let's just say in applied work, it's largely human observers. In basic research, we use equipment to detect responses. You probably already learned about the operant chamber, a lever press, a key pack. A computer can record these responses. So in automatic observation, it's sort of the device measures a response. And if it's an accurate device and it's measuring things accurately, that's great. In applied work, it's human observation, and humans are prone to error. So there's a lot more we could say about this, which, as I mentioned, we'll do in a couple weeks. So how are the observation periods defined? Are they continuous across a specified time period? So for example, am I going to measure a response or multiple responses across an entire school day? Am I going to carve up my observations into sessions? So I have an hour consultation. Let's just say I go to geriatric home because there's an individual who's engaging in aggressive behavior, and I have an hour consultation, an hour appointment. I could conduct multiple observations instead of recording the whole hour because you have a lot of other things to do. Let's carve up that 1 hour into several 10-minute sessions, observation periods. Now this is going to become important. Again, let's go back to think about our repeated measurement, right? So we could, when we have repeated measurement, we're generating a data point representative of a observation. If I have my 1 hour appointment and I collect data the entire time, a continuous observation, that's one data point. If I break it up into several sessions, several observations, then I have several data points. Another option would be trial by trial, right? So this is sort of skill acquisition work. If I'm trying to teach behaviors, I might do so in a trial format. We present an instruction, we wait for a response. If a response doesn't occur, maybe we prompt, maybe we do another intervention, and we record the response. That's one trial. Then we would begin another trial. So we could do 10 trials, 20 trials, multiple sessions of trials. Well, a lot more we could say about this, and we will going forward. Another thing is, what will the observers be doing? Is it you observing? If it's you observing, not too much to think about here. But if you're teaching somebody, or if you have an assistant like an RBT, will they be in one place recording the behavior, or do they have to move around? This is a consideration. Will they need a clipboard to record data? So one of the things that we'll talk about next week is that we should be recording data as it's occurring. So as a target behavior occurs, the data collector should enter it onto the paper, if that's the form they're using, or enter it in the computer if that's the form they're using immediately. Because if we sort of mentally track target responses and record them at the end, we're more prone to make error. So we want to keep an eye on that. Okay, so the considerations there: how are the observation periods defined? Is it continuous, or are they periods? And we could define those periods any way we want as long as they were representative. This is something important to point out: natural observation versus what I'm going to call analog, or what's called analog. And you'll see this. So now, if I'm working with a case, let's just say it's a student in a classroom and they're not following the teacher's instructions. So I want to work on compliance, and I've defined compliance to teacher instruction as the target behavior. I can assess that target response and intervene in the natural environment, right? In the classroom as it's occurring. There's a problem with that, though, because there's a lot of other things occurring. So when it gets time to conduct our analysis or intervention, there's a lot of stuff going on, and that could make for a sort of unstructured analysis, which can be difficult. The alternative is I create an analog, right? So I pull the child from the classroom to a resource room and I replicate what a teacher does. I provide instructions, I'm measuring the target response, analyzing it, developing an intervention. So we have these options. I often prefer much of the work I do is in an analog form, right? Now, this is a continuum. Obviously, if the problem's occurring in the natural environment, we need to be able to treat it in the natural environment. However, we could still first utilize the analog, get control over the behavior, and then program it such that it transfers whatever treatment gains we've accomplished, transfer to the natural environment. So again, a slightly different example. Child's engaging in aggressive behavior in the home. I go into the home and work with the child independently. So the aggression is now toward me in an area of the home. I analyze it, determine the causes, develop an intervention to reduce it with me. So I'm the one intervening. I have great control over the behavior. Then I'm going to teach mom and dad to implement my intervention. So now, in a sense, we went from a sort of analog condition to a more naturalistic condition. So we have options there, and that is really important to keep in mind. Again, with these observation periods, it could be trial by trial. So we want to represent the true state. Okay, I know this is a lot of material. Let's move on to measurement. This section is going to contain a lot of definitions. I'll highlight things that are really important to remember. So we'll kind of move from conceptual ideas of measurement of behavior and then get into the specifics of applied behavior analysis in measuring behavior. So the first thing to think about when we're measuring behavior is what type of measure are we going to use? And there are two primary types, indirect measures and direct measures. As you might guess, an indirect measure is you're getting a measurement of, for our purpose, behavior in some way that's different than actually observing the behavior. So an interview is an indirect measure, right? When I ask the teacher, how many times does Bobby get out of his seat? That is an indirect measure. She reports a number and I document that. So it's an indirect measure. If I ask a teacher, what are the skill deficits? And he reports A, B, C, and D, that is an indirect indice or measure of what's happening. So it's secondhand, filtered information. It's an inference, right? It gives us an idea of what's happening, and it's a useful measure to some extent, but it does not replace direct measure. So I have examples here using questionnaires. We'll talk about this more in other courses as well. The best case scenario and the most, ethically sound one for us as behavior analysts is to get a direct measure. We probably have some combination of both, but ultimately we're going to make our decisions based on the direct measure. So that is, we are actually going to observe the individual engaging in the target behaviors. And we're going to measure it. So that is a direct measure. And this would yield more valid data, right? As opposed to somebody saying, well, Bobby hit me 3 times yesterday. If I'm observing and I see Bobby actually hit 5 times, the data are more valid because I've observed it rather than relying on the secondhand information. So direct measures are favored, right? We should always move to get direct measures. So when we're considering indirect measures versus direct measures, we might there are sort of, again, two subcategories within that. I don't want you to get too caught up in all of these things. This is more the process and broad areas we're going to think about in the context of measurement of behavior. There is an indirect measure would be an outcome measure. We could utilize what's known as a permanent product. This is the observable result of behavior, what's left after the behavior occurs. So if we're trying to measure a student's completion of homework, a completed worksheet presumably is a good measure, right? That's a permanent product. They did the worksheet. There it is. I'm looking at it. So an indirect measure, I'm not observing the student complete the homework, but I see the final product. Workers on an assembly line, how many units they've actually built, right? I don't have to see them doing it, but I measure the outcome, the product. So an injury from SIB, another example. And again, this is as opposed to direct measure. In a direct measure, we're always going to observe the process of the person behaving, and that is more favored. Let's just consider the advantages and disadvantages of each of these, and then we'll move on to more specific measurement procedures. So the problem or the advantage of an outcome measure is you don't have to be there to observe, so it's very convenient. However, the disadvantage is great, because some behaviors don't always produce the same outcome, and the outcome can be produced by other behaviors. So a great example of the disadvantage of an outcome is if you are targeting, say you're trying to evaluate your exercise program, right? Or for another individual, right? So you're working with an individual who wants to lose weight, and you set them on this exercise program. And you're using weight loss as the measure to evaluate your exercise program. Well, the problem, it's a good measure because that is an ultimate goal, to lose weight. But if you're evaluating how well your exercise program is working, there's a problem, because people can lose weight also from dieting, right? So that confounds our ability to determine how effective our exercise program is, because if the person's also dieting or they're taking methamphetamines, that could also influence weight loss. So we have to consider the limitations of an outcome measure. So again, as I mentioned a few times, the best case scenario is we are using a direct measure. We're going to observe the individual engaging in the behavior. And this has a lot of advantages that we can, it's very flexible. It could accommodate a lot of different behaviors. With an outcome, you're restricted to very specific behaviors, or very specific outcomes rather, as indices of behavior. But the disadvantage is you have to have a system to measure multiple dimensions of a behavior. Now, I'll tell you what that means on the slide that follows, but we'll talk about each of these areas. Topography, we're not going to really talk about that, but that is essentially the form of behavior, what it looks like, right? So when you're considering process, you need to have an operational definition of the target behavior. What does it look like? Then you have to measure different dimensions of the behavior, and we'll talk about magnitude, frequency, duration, latency. Okay. So we're still talking about observation here, and we now know that a direct measure, or measuring the process of the person behaving, is favorable. The other thing to consider with an observation is how much of the behavior are we going to measure, right? Again, this is often a trade-off in how much labor is involved in actually observing and measuring behavior versus the accuracy and completeness of the data that you're getting. So, two options here. We can do a complete observation That is, we're going to schedule an observation and we're going to record every behavior or response that occurs. We could also call this continuous recording, right? So I set up a 10-minute observation and I record continuously across that 10 minutes everything that occurs, every target behavior that occurs. The other alternative would be to utilize a incomplete observation. This is more commonly known as discontinuous measurement or a sampling procedure or interval recording, interval sampling. So here we're going to schedule an observation, but we're not going to observe the entire time. We're only going to sample from that observation. And again, I'll make more sense of that as we move through this material. Okay, so we have continuous recording. We're going to observe the entire time and measure every instance of behavior. And we're going to talk about 2 ways to do that: event recording and duration recording. The other option would be discontinuous sampling or interval recording. So we're only going to record a subset of behavior. I'll talk about this again, but the way to distinguish these two is that here in continuous recording, we're going to measure every time the behavior occurs. We're either going to count it, maybe we do some calculations, maybe we record the duration. We'll talk about each of those individually. If we elect to use discontinuous sampling, we have to do a couple other steps. We have to divide our observation time or session time into equal intervals. I'll show you an example of this. So for example, if it's 10-minute observation, we might divide that 10 minutes into 1-minute intervals. So there are 10 1-minute intervals. And then we're going to record the occurrence of behavior during that interval. And we can do a calculation to convert it into a percentage of intervals. Next week, we're going to go through more explicit examples. These are sort of the large topic areas. So if we elect to use continuous recording, we have to measure it according to its dimensional qualities and quantities. And I don't want you to get too hung up on what I'm discussing here in terms of what these dimensions are, but basically you want to consider what is a property of a behavior that could be measured in some way, right? What are the dimensions of the behavior that can be quantified, that we could attach a number to? And those dimensions include the temporal dimension and the dimension of repeatability. So if you think about behavior, something like a headbang, or let's change the context here. You're working with senior citizens and you're looking at medication compliance. So you give them their meds and how many do they actually take. So consuming a medication has a temporal dimension, right? You say, here are your meds, or take your meds. What is the latency between when that instruction is provided and when they actually take the med? You could also measure duration. How long does it take them to consume their medication? You could also look at repeatability, right? So consuming a medication could be repeated 1, 2, 3, so we could count it. If we could count it over a time period, we could convert it to a frequency. Let's hold off on interresponse time. So what we're talking about here in terms of dimension is when we think about behavior does occur in time. It starts, it lasts for a certain amount of time, it ends, there's time in between responses or target behaviors, and there are instances we could count. So let's look at all these in a little more detail. Focusing on the temporal dimensions first. And these specific things are very important to remember, each of these measurement procedures. So the first temporal dimension is latency. We can utilize a latency measure, and that is, it's the duration of time between a stimulus onset, like an instruction, for example, and the occurrence of a behavior. So for example, the latency between when an instruction, point to red, is delivered and when the response occurs. Or the latency to the first occurrence of out-of-seat behavior after class begins. So what we're talking about there is that we're referencing an environmental event, which I'm calling a stimulus onset. So in this example, this illustration, the green light begins, or it turns on. Then time starts. And here I have 45 seconds of time elapsing before the driver in front of you begins to drive. So there's a latency between when the light turned green and when the driver started to drive. 45 seconds is an excessively long time, so you'd probably be laying on your horn at that point. But the point is, latency could be a useful measure. I've worked with individuals who have a long latency to answer a question like, what is your name? Right, so let's consider that in terms of a clinical example. Again, we'll focus on the geriatric population. Maybe they're starting to experience early onset dementia. And you say, hello, I'm David, what is your name? And 2 minutes elapses. That is sort of a behavior that could interfere with that person's quality of life, because if they're in public, people are going to think that's odd, right? So our target could be to decrease the latency between asking the question, what is your name, and when that person responds with their name. Maybe an appropriate latency would be 3 seconds or less. Okay, so these are the things we need to begin to think about when we're considering target behaviors. And again, I would urge you to look to Java, and we will certainly do this across your time in the program to think about this stuff or come up with examples. Another temporal dimension is duration. This is going to be the time from behavior onset to the end of the behavior. So, for example, the duration of on-task behavior. The person begins being on task, it lasts for a certain amount of time, and then they go off task. Another example, the duration of out-of-seat behavior. The student begins in his or her seat, they get out, a timer is started to measure duration. Maybe they run around for a minute, they get back in their seat, you stop the timer. So we have a duration of one instance of out-of-seat behavior. Of course, we could look at measurement over time, total duration, average duration, things of that nature. So once we have the unit of measurement, the data, we can begin to calculate the data in a variety of ways. So this example I have down here, again, focusing on driving behavior. The response begins, the person begins to drive, time elapses, driving ends, and they stop. So we can measure that duration. And again, I want you to think of these in the context of an observation. So there might be multiple instances, and we could get each duration, each instance and its duration, or the total duration. Now let's shift to the dimensions of repeatability, right? So behavior not only occurs in time and across time, but in doing so, there are dimensions of repeatability. It occurs repeatedly in time. So we could count each instance of a behavior, each occurrence of SIB, each occurrence of a mand or a request. Each response could vary in duration, but here we're just interested in how many times the behavior occurred during our observation. So for example, I have time going across a 10-minute observation, and we see 1 instance of SIB, 2 instances, 3 instances, 4 instances, 5 instances, 6 instances, 7. So in this 10-minute observation, I counted 7 instances of SIB, and that could be my measure. I could conduct another 10-minute observation and again measure it. Now, let's consider that each of these measures, for example, the 7 SIBs, is going to be plotted as a data point. So I get my repeated measurement, and I'm going to just keep plotting the count of SIB. Now, if I have a count and I understand the duration of the session, I could do a calculation and calculate a frequency. This would be the count or cycle of responses divided by time. So I have my 7 responses, 7 SIBs divided by a 10-minute observation would be 0.7 SIBs per minute. Often you will see practitioners utilizing a frequency measure for a variety of reasons, but it can sort of account for different observation lengths. Often we try to keep our observation times consistent, but if we increased one observation to 20 minutes, utilizing a frequency is still sort of the same, whether it's a 10-minute observation or a 20-minute observation. Okay, so those are really the measures. Let's just go over those one more time. Within the temporal realm, you can measure latency, duration. Within repeatability, count, or frequency. We'll talk about inter-response time separately. And spend a lot of time beginning to understand what these are. Okay, so frequency versus rate. The reason I have this here is because sometimes you'll hear practitioners utilize these terms interchangeably, and there is, in science, there's a distinction. It's probably not too important to dwell on, but I think it's worth mentioning. So in behavior analysis, we use frequency rather than saying a rate. And it refers to a ratio, count divided by time. Rate has different meanings outside of behavior analysis in other areas of science. So speed would be a rate. So distance divided by time. That said, you will hear some practitioners say the rate of a behavior or the frequency. So they may use the terms interchangeably, but there is a slight distinction. So, just something to think about. The other thing about frequency is consideration has to be given to how often the behavior occurred given the amount of time it was possible for the behavior to occur. Or another way of phrasing it, you have to consider how long it was possible to respond versus not respond. I'll give some examples of this next week, but consider this example. Assessing behavior under a baseline condition versus a treatment condition. Let's say the behavior is aggression, right? And we measure under baseline, there's no intervention. We have the person, they could aggress whenever they want. Then under treatment, if the person aggresses once, they get one hit in. Let's just say this is a very restrictive intervention, but let's just say we utilize what we call a hands down procedure. We bring their hands to the lap, we say hands down, and we hold them there for 10 seconds. Now that is 10 seconds that the response cannot occur. So when we're making these comparisons, we have to consider that. Again, that's sort of a higher level practical thing we have to think about, and I will mention that next week and then further on when we start discussing conducting analyses. Okay, the last repeatability dimension, probably one that could be difficult to understand, is inter-response time. This is the amount of time that elapses between responses. Here I have 2 responses, but it could be multiple responses. So again, utilizing my illustration, during a 10-minute observation, we see SIB occur, and then time elapses. Let's just say it's 3.5 minutes, and then another SIB occurs. So that time between these 2 instances is the inter-response time, right? Or the IRT. Then in the second instance, 4 minutes elapsed until the next instance of SIB, right? Now, inter-response time has a variety of uses. In research, it could be an interesting measure. But in the applied realm, it is also important. Maybe not as apparently useful as it is in research, but I'll give you 2 areas where it's very useful. Let's just say that we were intervening, right? We've done our analysis, we come to intervention, and we want to provide reinforcement as long as the individual is not engaging in self-injurious behavior. Well, if we understand the average IRT, right, we could combine these two or combine the IRTs across an observation period and average them out, we could then select our reinforcement period to be less than the average IRT. Let's just say, for example, that the average IRT is 4 minutes, for sake of example. If I schedule reinforcement to occur every 2 minutes, I'm more likely to be able to deliver it for the absence of SIB, thereby reinforcing the absence of SIB. So these are things we're going to consider at a further date, future time. The other consideration would be if we're talking about something like spacing the time between responses, so appropriate behavior, like the individual, let me come up with a good example here. You taught them to request a break instead of engaging in aggression. But now instead of just saying break once, they keep saying break. So therefore, we'd want to increase the inner response time between when they're saying break. Again, probably a difficult example to think about, but nevertheless, IRT can be useful too. So those are the dimensions, and I want you to really spend time understanding these, work with them, make definition cards if you need to, because these are going to be very important on quizzes and exams and so forth. Okay, so those are all continuous measurement procedures. Now, continuous measurement is labor intensive, right? You have to observe the entire time. And if you are working as a consultant and you're consulting to a classroom and you ask the teacher or a teacher's aide to observe one student the entire time, they can't do that. They have too many other things to do. So one thing we could do, rather than get a continuous measure or a complete picture of all the data, of all the behavior that's occurring, we can use discontinuous measurement. That is, we could take a sample of the behavior that's occurring. And there we're going to use interval recording or discontinuous sampling. And there are 3 approaches to doing so. Again, what's important to note here is when we utilize this, we divide an observation time into equal duration intervals. So for example, 10-minute observation broken down into 10 1-minute intervals. Let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, I'm using pen and paper data collection, and I'll show you an example shortly, but I have space to enter when the behavior occurs, and there are 10 of them, and they all represent 1-minute periods. And I have a timer to signal every 1 minute, so I know when I go from interval 1 to interval 2. Now I'm going to assign or utilize one of these recording procedures. And I'm going to describe them first. Whole interval recording, we're going to record a response if it occurs throughout the entire interval. Okay, if it doesn't occur through the entire 1-minute interval, it does not get recorded. The next one is partial interval recording. Here we're going to score the response if it occurs at any portion of the interval. Then there's momentary time sampling. The response is going to be scored if it occurs at the end of the interval. So what we're doing here is we're going to be estimating the amount of behavior that occurred. The estimation will be consistent, so we're not worried about the validity of the data. We know it's an estimation. We know there is a margin of error, but it will be a consistent margin of error, so it's not particularly problematic for our assessment or treatment evaluation. But what we're trading off, or what we're gaining by taking the sample, is less labor-intensive data collection. So We're not getting the complete picture, but sometimes the more labor involved, the more problematic data collection be in terms of validity and reliability. So these are all of the procedures we talked about sort of laid out, and I'll point to sort of the different methods and how it equals out for us. So let's consider this top example similar to the examples I provided earlier. So we have time going across the screen as denoted by the arrow pointing to the right. And each of these black lines represents behavior occurring. Let's say it's out of seat behavior. And it starts, it lasts a certain duration of time, and it stops. So if we are calculating or measuring a frequency or a count, we see that behavior occurs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So in that 10-minute period, out of seat behavior occurred 8 times. We could also look at a duration. Let's just say, for example, we had a timer, and when the child got out of his seat, we started the timer and then we stop it, right? So we have, I'm making this up, 20 seconds, 2 minutes, and so forth. And I could total up that duration and divide it by the 10-minute period and come up with a percentage, the percentage of time during a 10-minute period that this individual was out of his or her seat. So that's sort of our continuous recording methodologies. Now let's look at whether we use whole interval, partial interval, or momentary time sampling. So now again, we have our 10-minute period, but it's divided into 1-minute intervals. And when we record data, it's not black lines like this. It's typically a number. Some people will use tally marks, yes or no. We'll talk about that next week. So here we're only going to record out of seat behavior if it occurs during the entire interval. Now, again, think of this as a blank data sheet and a timer sounds, right? So I'm observing out of seat behavior occurs, but it did not occur for the entire 1 minute, so it does not get recorded there. It did occur for the entire 1 minute here, so we're going to record, check, or plus, it occurred. So if we go through that process of using whole interval recording, we see that we only actually scored 1 instance of behavior because only 1 time did it occur during the entire interval. So that's 10%. So if you get down here to the bottom where it says summary of errors, we see that whole interval recording has a problem of underestimating the response. That is, if only partial intervals are not counted, it's sort of an underestimation that the behavior occurred, but it just wasn't counted because it did not occur during the entire interval. Now, a couple things to think about here. We could shorten the interval duration, but then we're increasing the labor involved in our recording, right? So if I go from 1 minute intervals to 10-second intervals, it's going to be more sensitive. We're going to capture more behavior, but it's very hard to record data in 10-second intervals unless you're utilizing a computer. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. So let's move to partial interval recording. Same data stream, but here we're going to record the data if it occurs anytime during the interval. So we record it in this interval, the second one, the third one, the fourth, fifth, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. So now we have that the response out of seat behavior occurred for 9 out of 10 intervals, or 90%, right? With partial interval recording, there's an overestimation of behavior that occurs. Because if you consider these partial instances, there wasn't a lot of out of seat behavior here, but it still gets recorded. So partial interval is sort of not as labor intensive because if behavior occurred once, you score it, and then you wouldn't have to observe for the rest of the interval. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Let's look at momentary time sampling. So recall, if the response is occurring at the end of an interval, you're going to score it. So it gets scored here in interval 2, in interval 3, 7, 8, and 9, because it's occurring at the end of the interval. So now we have 5 out of 10 intervals without a seat behavior, or 50%. Here the sampling errors are random. Now, the thing about momentary time sampling that I think is a major advantage is if I'm asking a teacher who has many other things to do to record whether or not Bobby is out of his seat, if I apply momentary time sampling, I could set a timer. Let's just say I make the intervals 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, the timer sounds. All I need is for the teacher to look over, see if Bobby's at his desk, and if he is, it gets recorded as in seat. If he's not, it gets recorded as out of seat behavior. So it's a less labor intensive method for data collection. Now again, all of these suffer the fact that they're an estimation. But if the estimation is consistent across repeated measures, it's not problematic. It's not necessarily inaccurate data. Okay, so we'll talk more about applications of this next week. But I think this is enough content to get you set up and beginning to understand how we're going to go about selecting target behaviors, operationally defining them, and measuring them.